Thank you, Cynthia, for sharing your research in New Caledonia. Let's move now to our last speaker. Is Libby online or would you see? Oh, nice to meet you. Our two last speakers will be Jennifer Melville and Libby Mulan, who will present the project Facing Our Past, which is led by the National Trust of Scotland. Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, you have 15 minutes, so no.
Yeah, so if you let me know.
Okay, I can, yeah, that's okay.
Thanks very much. Hello, everyone. It's lovely to have such an international audience today in Scotland, and great to be following Cinzia as well, talking about New Caledonia, because it strikes me that an awful lot of the climate change problems she's experiencing there have actually had impact on our own properties. As poor Fiona Mackenzie will know, having lived on Canada for a while, that our properties too are being impacted tremendously by climate change. We're finding, sadly, we don't have warmer weather, it seems, especially not today, but we do have much heavier rain and more intense storms, which are affecting our buildings tremendously. So as I said, today, just to explain, and I don't want to bore the pants off the Scottish people in the audience, but I wanted to explain that although the National Trust for Scotland has national in its title, it isn't national in the sense that it's funded by national government. We are a membership organisation, but the biggest membership organisation in Scotland with around 330,000 members. So, the spread, the geographical spread of the properties that we can serve and care for is pretty remarkable. You can see that they're all over the country, not just historic houses, of course, but land, wild landscape, and all sorts of classes of buildings, cliffs, outposts all over the place, and of course, many islands from St Kilda in the far west to Canna, where Fiona was and has been talking about so eloquently today, and right up in the northeast too. We even have property on Shetland, the north of Scotland. And of course, there are many places in the Caribbean which have Scottish place names, not just Scottish place names, but as you'll see in the lower right-hand corner there, places that are actually given the same name as some of the properties we care for. So Leith Hall is one of our properties, and the family, the Leith Hay family, have many, many connections with the Caribbean, some of them linking that house to the darkest histories of the Caribbean. Of course, we have a whole area in Barbados called Scotland District, and I think moving on, it's very important to realise that not just the elite of Scotland ended up in the Caribbean, but the most lowly of farm workers. So a place name like Haddo Pen in Jamaica is indicative of a very ordinary Scot coming there, but possibly somebody who lived on the Haddo estate in northeast Scotland and ended up with a small holding rather than a plantation, which was named Haddo Pen. We started our project Facing Our Past in 2020 at the very beginning of lockdown. It was a wonderful opportunity, in fact, but I was actually based in South Africa at the time, sort of stuck there for 4 months, not that I was complaining, but it was a wonderful opportunity to create an international external steering group for the project. So we had people from the Caribbean, a curator from the Caribbean on the steering panel, and also the Director General of Mount Vernon in Washington, D.C. So it was an incredible opportunity to bring together an international group of people to advise on how. Now, one of the things we needed to do was get to the source of all the known connections to enslavement across the properties. And inevitably, we found examples like this, Brodick Castle on the island of Arran, where Susanna Euphemia Beckford, the favoured, one of the two daughters of Beckford, but the one he much preferred, married the 10th Duke of Hamilton in 1852, and through her father in it was left fantastic treasures from a family that had accrued their wealth through historic enslavement. But of course, we have other properties like the birthplace of Robert Burns, and Robert Burns's complex history, but illustrative of so many Scots, is that he started life in tremendous hardship and at one point actually signed up to go and work as a driver on a Jamaican plantation, but then quickly afterwards found fame through his poetry and song, and ultimately got caught up in the anti-slavery movement, producing the famous song "Slave's Lament," although there's some debate about how much he actually put into composing it. But we've got other stories that we're not telling at the moment about ordinary people. For example, J.M. Barrie's birthplace in Angus, which is celebrating his life as an amazing writer and author, of course, of Peter Pan, is also significant because it was a weaver's cottage, and it was in hundreds of cottages particularly across Angus, where linen was woven and then exported to be used as clothing for enslaved. The only voice we've got of the enslaved, rather than those enslaving them, are these books on Canna. The Lorne Campbells descended from this chap, Archibald Campbell, who served as governor in Guadeloupe, Dominica, Martinique, St. Lucia, and Grenada, and later governor of Jamaica. These books actually list people enslaved in Dominica, I think it is, Fiona. Yeah. And I've highlighted a few of the actual names there, and I think it's significant they were given sometimes just a first name, an occupation, and then that some of them are actually have fled. Bit of an infection at the moment. But other islands, of course, exist in terms of our connections. We initially restricted our research to enslavement, historic enslavement, but deliberately keeping the slavery element away from colonialism. We have subsequently enlarged to cover all sorts of hitherto forgotten subjects, including colonialism, empire, gender issues, and those of class as well, which really come to the fore in a very important way. We've recently taken over management of the Willow Street Tea Rooms in Glasgow, and that's going to allow us, we hope, to really lock in and embrace and engage with the Asian community in Glasgow, which we have hitherto failed to reach at our properties. At a very basic level, although our properties are spread all over Scotland, they remain bastions of middle class white people who can afford a car, for example, at a very basic level, just to get to many of the properties. But at the Macintosh at Willow, we have the amazing opportunity to highlight the suffering and the working conditions of tea pickers in Sri Lanka. And quite miraculously, in another collection we own in Kirkcudbright in southwest Scotland, we have a fabulous collection of photographs that were taken by an artist called Edward Atkinson Hornell, who travelled to Sri Lanka in the 1920s. And these photographs are now being lauded in Sri Lanka as almost unique examples of photographs from that early colonial period of ordinary working people, rather than the civil servants who were managing them. So we're hoping that they will form a very interesting and important insert into the interpretation at Macintosh at Willow, but also potentially also at a proposal to develop identifications of women across the whole city, whether that be in the form of projections on buildings or whatever. But that's just at the very beginning. Be analysed. Now, Annalie worked with us in 2021-22 to develop a really interesting body of work, very much working with the community at Balmacara in the northwest of Scotland. That's a property where the highlight is really a focus on crofting. And she worked with the community, with the school, to create a body of work, and DCA in Dundee, of course, the Dundee printmaking workshop, to create a body of work. And for me, what was particularly interesting about this was her focus on indentured servitude in the Caribbean. We've looked a lot at enslavement, but the indentured servants who went out formed a very important part of the community, and of course married into the community and became part of the heritage. So that the Scottish contingent of the Caribbean communities is a very important one for them. And I was in Barbados at the time it became a republic, and I know everyone was celebrating the new tartan they just had designed, and there was pipe music in the street and so on. But thinking again about how our very wealthy elite houses can actually give insight into ordinary people and their impact abroad. Let's take, for example, House of the Binns just outside Edinburgh, which has just recently reopened after a major refurbishment. The very first member of the family there was General Tam Dael, who was actually a mercenary soldier in Russia and came away with a lot of treasure from there, and was eventually appointed Charles I's head man really in Scotland in terms of managing the armies. And he was responsible for the capture of a lot of people just south of Edinburgh at a battle that took place at Rullion Glen in the Pentland Hills. It's actually the scene I used to look across to as a child. And those men were captured, and they were then imprisoned in Edinburgh, and subsequently those Covenanters, they were freedom fighters in effect of their day, looking for liberation in religious terms, were sent across to Barbados as indentured servants. But that kind of narrative is not something that we as an organization can, nor should, I think, be developing ourselves. It's very important for us now that we democratize and engage other people, academics, research teams, and individuals like Libby, who's going to join me now, who's a postgraduate student on the Museum Studies course at St Andrews University. And Libby really epitomizes everything I've been striving to do at the National Trust for Scotland, in that she's young. She's a young career professional. She's American from North Carolina and has studied in Massachusetts. So she is able to bring the international dimension to our work, which I regard as absolutely vital. For far too long, we looked at our organization and our properties in a patriarchal, hierarchical, and very Scottish-centric viewpoint. And just as Leander was talking about somebody this morning was talking about looking at our properties from an international perspective, so that the focus becomes from somewhere else. And when I was on Canna last, I felt very strongly the feeling that all of a sudden I was looking at the world from the viewpoint of Canna. I think it's tremendously important to bring in the voices of other people from other places to examine and explore. Now, Libby has just started her research on Culloden, so this is very much a work in progress. We're going to go up to Culloden together in July, but she'll be able to fill you in more. Thanks very much.
Hello, everybody. I'll keep this short because I have a lunch. But again, I'm Libby. I'm a current student here, and I'm very excited to be conducting research for the National Trust in support of this project. This summer, I'm looking into the non-elite Jacobites in prison during the 45 Rising, and how the loss at Culloden led to the diasporic movement of Scots to the island of Barbados. Quickly, I just want to touch on some details of the Rising to situate my research. For decades leading up to the 45 Rising, Scotland is in a state of relative unrest due to the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution, the Union of 1707, and the Jacobite movement in support of the Stuart monarchy. And this all comes to a head in 45 as Charles Edward, who's here, leads a relatively successful military campaign until the Battle of Culloden, where the Jacobites are massacred by the Duke of Cumberland's forces, effectively ending the Rising. Afterwards, a letter of patent is issued by the king stating that most prisoners will be pardoned upon the condition that they sell their indenture to one of two merchants, Samuel Smith of London or Richard Gildart of Liverpool, who is the very kind-looking gentleman. Next slide. So as I began my research, I started by reading existing texts, especially Prisoners of the 45 by Seaton and Abbott, and using primary prison lists from the National Archives to create lists of prisoners. And then I used these to compare with David Dobson's reference text, Barbados and Scotland Links, where I found 170 Jacobite prisoners ending up in Barbados. As I've cross-referenced each list, I've compiled as much information about individuals as possible and have determined there are two significant dates of transportation to the island, the 20th and the 31st of March, 1747, as well as a recurring reference to the ship, the Frere. The ship is also listed as having arrived from London, and I expect that it's the case that The indentures of the Jacobites on board the ship were owned by Samuel Smith, and that he transported and sold them in Barbados. My focus now is on determining what happened to the Jacobites upon arrival in Barbados. And at the time, we know colonial Barbados developed the earliest successful sugar industry in the English Caribbean. By the 18th century, sugar is the most important commodity in the world. The sugar revolution in Barbados relied entirely on the forced labor and enslavement of captive Africans and the indentured service of convicts and lower class British citizens. And due to its success, the plantation system in Barbados becomes the blueprint for the low country colonies along the east coast of America, like Georgia and the Carolinas. Because of this structure, I expect that most of these folks went on to work on sugar plantations. However, there are over 500 plantations across the island in the mid-18th century, as can be seen on this map by Thomas Jeffries, which has made narrowing down where to start looking very difficult. But I've been using the UCL Slavery Compensation Database to search for surnames and any reference to Scots, but I've had little luck so far, but I'm still looking. As I was searching, I did come across the Applewhite Frere family, who are connected to several plantations in Barbados at the time, and I'm curious if there is a link between the name of the ship and this family, and perhaps I'll be able to find some records of Scots there. It's still very early in my research, but it's already very clear how little documentation exists for the lower classes in Barbados in the 18th century. And I suspect the lack of documentation of Jacobites is caused by a myriad of factors, in part due to the governing plantocracy of the island, but also as a result of the relationships forged between the enslaved population and the indentured population on sugar plantations. Similarly, it has been more difficult to find plantation records, newspapers, or any documentation predating the year 1800 than I had expected at the start. At the outset of this research, I had anticipated finding cases where Jacobites, upon the completion of their indenture, became quite prosperous, as it is seen elsewhere in the Caribbean, but the elite Jacobites who were transported following Culloden became even more wealthy after becoming entangled in and profiting off of the Atlantic slave trade. This isn't something that I've seen yet in Barbados, but I'm not ruling it out entirely. I think it's equally likely that there will be cases of Jacobites who live a relatively normal life after the end of their indenture. Regardless, I think that focusing on the quote unquote normal people will make this research a bit more difficult and hopefully a little bit more exciting. And I'm certain that I'll encounter many more roadblocks as I continue on, but I'm hopeful that by the end of the summer, I'll be able to paint a bit of a picture of what life is like for the Jacobites on the island from their transportation, service on, and eventual freedom. So thank you.